So I recently made a video about kebab norsk, which is the name that is given to kebab Norwegian, although in linguistic terms this is described as being Norwegian multi-ethnolect. Now this term of a multi-ethnolect, to go over what that actually means, the definition given by Dottier and Dorlein is a linguistic style and or variety that is part of linguistic practices of speakers of more than two ethnic and by consequence linguistic backgrounds, and contains an unusually high number of features from more than one language, but has one clear base language, generally the dominant language of the society where the multi-ethnolect is in use. With this definition, then, we can find several of these multi-ethnolects being spoken across European cities. But are they similar to one another? Is this feature going to last? And can we find any shared features across these despite the differences? Let's lay out a few examples. So of course I have this video about kebab norsk in particular to really get into the nitty gritty of what's going on there. We actually find these across Scandinavia. In Sweden, there is an area called Rinkeby, which is outside of the capital, and the Swedish there called Rinkeby Svenska, and this is basically the kebab svenska, the version of kebab norsk found in Norway. In Denmark, it is particularly found in Copenhagen, the capital, and therefore it's called Københavnsdansk. This is sometimes also called perkedansk, but perke can be seen as being an offensive term that's used, so linguists prefer to use Copenhagen Danish. With German, there are a few different varieties. There is Kiesdeutsch, which basically means neighborhood German and is spoken in a few different German cities in a few different variants, but a more colloquial name for it is Kanaksprach. Now, this Kanak, again, is a derogatory term for people of North African or other Middle Eastern origin, so that's more of a colloquial rather than a linguistic term. In the Netherlands, generally, ththese languages are called straattaal, which simply means street language, while in Belgium, they are called citétaal, which means city language, obviously borrowing the French word city there. In England, there is one that has been quite well studied, which is that is spoken in London. And by the media, this was often called Jafaican, so a mixture of fake Jamaican, based on the idea that this was people attempting to speak Jamaican patois, but doing it poorly, although linguistically this isn't the case. The more linguistic term that is applied to it is MLE, which stands for Multicultural London English. However, for me, growing up and still today, the way we referred to this kind of, accent, as we would have called it coming from London, was roadman, to speak like a roadman. Cheshire et al. Describe why these multi-ethnolects have sprung up across several European cities. They write, the reasons for the emergence of European multi-ethnolects at this point in history is presumably linked to specific types of community formation in urban areas, which have seen very large-scale immigration from developing countries. People of different language backgrounds have settled in already quite underprivileged neighborhoods, and economic deprivation has led to the maintenance of close kin and neighborhood ties. Castells writes of prosperous metropolises containing communities such as these. It is this distinctive feature of being globally connected and locally disconnected, physically and socially, that makes megacities a new urban form. So it's within these megacities that we get the rise of these multi-ethnolects being created. Now, as I mentioned in the video about kebab norsk, what makes this special and different to, say, Irish English or German English dialects and accents, things like this, is the amount of languages that come together to create this new form. So in terms of kebab norsk, we find influence from Turkish, from Tamil, Arabic, from Pashto, from various languages from the Indian subcontinent, Berber, Chilean Spanish, Swedish, and Kurdish, as well as, of course, a lot coming in from English, particularly through hip-hop, through rap from the United States. This is slightly different in Germany, where the Turkish community is much larger, and so there are far more Turkish influences, both in terms of phonology and in terms of new vocabulary, as well as Arabic, Urdu, and from Kurdish too, with, of course, American English words coming in as well. Dutch, the situation is a little bit different with Straattaal. Turkish has a surprisingly smaller influence, whereas Arabic, particularly Moroccan Arabic, has quite a large one. What's different to the Dutch situation is that because of its colonial history, we also have some influence from Caribbean forms, particularly from Papiamento, from the ABC Islands, as well as from the Creole language spoken in Suriname, which is called Sranantongo, which we'll see in a few examples. Of course, what's different between Kebabnorsk, Kiesdeutsch, and Straattaal is that we have the base language being different each time, Norwegian, German, and Dutch. And then on top of that, we have all these ad strata which come in from various languages. In British MLE, we have really a rather different makeup. So there, Turkish doesn't really play a big role, Arabic has a smaller role, and far more importantly, we have Jamaican patois and other Caribbean varieties of English, as well as variety of Englishes that come from the Indian subcontinent, various West African nations, and various languages from the Indian subcontinent. There we also have an interesting interplay where we have, of course, the base language as British English, specifically that English spoken in the south of England, but we also have new words, terms, pronunciations being influenced by United States English as well. So one thing that makes these multi-ethnolects different is interference. This is a term that's used in linguistics when people speaking one language often through immigration move to a new place and start speaking another language as their second language. But because they make mistakes, then these mistakes, if done in a big group, will be passed on to the next generation and eventually become part of that language. To give an example of what this might look like, my parents are both first language Dutch speakers. They moved to the United Kingdom and they learned to speak English. However, sometimes you can hear a slight Dutch accent, which I absolutely do not mock in any way, shape or form, when they speak English. So just to highlight how this looks, we can compare the very simple phrase of saying, I come from the Netherlands, which is, of course, correct English. Now in Dutch, this would be, ik kom uit Nederland. Now notice that a lot of this is exactly the same. The I, come, and Nederland are recognizable. So a few ways that we might get Dutch-English interference is if my parents were not so good in English, if they knew some of the words, they may pronounce it differently. So instead of I come, they may say ik kom, I come, which sounds more like Dutch kom. And Netherlands, notice that this th sound is not present in Dutch. So they may say Nederland, like this, because it's easier, they don't have the same word. We may also, outside of the realm of phonology, find interference from the way that the sentence is built up. So notice that in English, we use the verb to come from, whereas in Dutch, the verb that is used is ik kom uit, I come out of Netherlands, even though we don't have to add in the of and the. So perhaps another kind of interference might be I come out Netherlands if you directly translate it. So you can see there are some differences that we could possibly expect if we had Dutch-English interference. So this appears to be part of what is creating a difference between these standard varieties of the language and then these multi-ethnolects, as we have people that speak a whole range of different languages then going over, immigrating and learning to speak, for example, Norwegian. But what's interesting in the study of these multi-ethnolects is that it's not just people speaking one language changing to another language. It's a whole range of different languages and then learning at the same time to speak a new language. And so it's interesting to compare what kind of linguistic situation, what kind of linguistic output do we have from that, and how does it differ from if they say learn Norwegian, if they learn German, or if they learn English. Well, that's what I'm going to try and do in this video. So when it comes to multi-ethnolects, we can note some interesting things about the phonology. That's the sound of the language and how that changes. If we look at Straattaal, for instance, we can see that most Straattaal takes over a Moroccan kind of phonology. So if a Moroccan first language Moroccan speaker learns to speak Dutch, they can have quite a strong accent. And it seems that with Straattaal, people take on this accent. This is interesting because it's not just people who are first language Moroccan speakers who sound like this, but even if you're a first language Swahili speaker or a first language Dutch speaker, if you're learning to speak Straattaal in this environment, you take on a kind of Moroccan accent. This is quite interesting because the amount of Moroccan immigrants and the amount of Turkish immigrants in the areas where Straattal is being spoken is about the same. So how come that Moroccan has had so much more of an impact on the pronunciation than Turkish? Well, there's a few sociological reasons for this. One is that Moroccan Arabic actually has a higher status as a language in these communities as opposed to Turkish. And the second is that Moroccan immigrant groups are more open to outsiders than Turkish immigrant groups, which tend to form more closed communities. This probably means that Moroccan is more suited as a kind of bridging accent across these different groups from different linguistic and ethnic backgrounds. In German, we have precisely the opposite situation, where Turks form by far the largest group, and so Turkish phonology is something that has come into Kiesdeutsch, and so it has also been referred to as Turkish German before. In Emily, we find a slightly different situation, where a lot of the phonology, particularly the vowels in vowels such as goat and face, are from Jamaican patois, and so they become almost more like a monophthong. In my own slightly Geordie influenced English, it's a clear diphthong in these, so it's quite difficult to do, like goat and face, whereas in the Jamaican patois it becomes more like goat, face. And this is what we find in MLE. Now, this may be because of Jamaican influence. A lot of Jamaican immigrants came to London during the 60s and afterwards. But part of it may also be because this sits in between the pronunciations found in various English forms on the Indian subcontinent and various ones found in West Africa, where the two second largest groups came from. And so it may have made a good midpoint between these various accents that came to be, so that when they came together, this was a logical point that everyone sort of could reach with their pronunciations after some time together. What we then find in a lot of these multi-ethnolects are integration loans. Now, just to reiterate the point that they aren't all creating a mixed language at this point. There is a clear standard base of a language. So in Emily, that's English. But what we see with these integration loans is that we have words or small phrases from some of these first languages coming into people's second languages and being used. But what's interesting is that it's not just people who speak those first languages that use them, but everyone, whether you're from a background that speaks the language these loan words came from or not. So here are a few examples that we see from the various multi-ethnolects around Northern Europe. One that's quite popular is the Arabic phrase wallah or wallah billah, which I'll go into a little bit further on, which means like I swear to God. This is found in the Copenhagen multi-ethnolect, as well as in a few different ways in the Swedish and Norwegian ones. Several of these words come from Turkish too, like using the word lan. A lot of these are almost taboo. They can be curse words, of course, using the name of God to swear upon, and the word lan itself having quite a rude meaning in Turkish. But these are used frequently in these multi-ethnolects, probably because they are used by adolescents almost exclusively, and adolescents, particularly those from underdeveloped urban areas, are often using more curse words than other people, and so these words are used more frequently. Another feature that we can see, which is quite interesting, is that in Citétal we see that a lot of the words being used are of Italian origin. Now this is because this was the first large immigrant group to come into Belgium, particularly mining areas such as Genk, following the Second World War. They came to work in these mining regions, and they are the ones that brought over the first layer of this multi-ethnolect that would spring up. So still a word for talking there is parlare, obviously from parlare, Italian for to speak. So this is interesting because now, even though there are hardly any immigrants from Italy coming over, this was of course in the 1960s, these Italian words are still being used by immigrants of various backgrounds and second generation children of immigrants in these areas that are speaking Citétal. So part of what goes into these multi-ethnolects is which immigrant group got there first and established the base layer, this base layer then oftentimes continuing. Something similar can be seen in MLE, where of course the Jamaican patois that was spoken by Jamaicans and related forms of Caribbean English also seem to have formed an important part of both the phonology and in terms of the special vocabulary of MLE, something that can still be seen today with all of these examples coming from Jamaican patois. What's interesting, however, is that several of these words that come over are being used at the same time in different multiethnolects. So the Turkish word kız for girl is found both in the Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian varieties. I mentioned already the Arabic influenced wallah or wallah, which is swear by Allah, which is found in all of the Scandinavian multiethnolects as well as in Strattal. Now, the reason for this probably is that many of the immigrants coming over are from the Middle East and speak Arabic, so it makes sense. What's more interesting, however, is the final example, which is again this wallah wallah, but that it has acquired a particular meaning that it does not actually have in Arabic, and that is as a question statement or an affirmation. So within kebabnorsk and within Rinkeby-svenska, you have this ability of the word wallah to be as a question, like asking really. So you can say, did you go to the shop? Wallah. And then you can also use wallah as an affirmation. Did you go to the shop? Wallah. Wallah. Yes, really, I did. And it's interesting because this is not the way that this word is used in Arabic. This is developed separately both in Norway and in Sweden. So here we see the creation of new grammaticalized forms of language. Let's take a look at syntax as well, as we see some interesting developments occurring in various of these multi-ethnolects. One of these examples is playing around with V2 word order. These are a little bit harder to explain for English speakers because several of the Nordic languages and indeed German have particular rules where the word order is inverted in certain kinds of phrases. So while in English, if you say I was sick and yesterday I was sick, the word order doesn't change. You just add in yesterday. However, in Swedish, if you were sick, you would say jag var sjuk. But if you were sick yesterday, you would say igår var jag sjuk. So the difference is between I was sick and yesterday was I sick. Now this is a rule that is followed, but what we find in the multi-ethnolect is that this inversion is ignored and they use the same form. So jag var sjuk, igår jag var sjuk. This is found interestingly in both the Swedish form, in the Danish form, and in the German form. Notice also that in Kiesdeutsch, the zum, so to the, is also omitted. And that's something that we also find that these particles, prepositions, are often omitted in Kiesdeutsch. We also find interesting things happening in the morphology, in the build-up of words, particularly in the overuse of the common gender. Again, this one is a little bit harder to describe for monolingual English speakers because in English, nouns no longer have grammatical gender. This isn't the case for the Nordic languages for Dutch and German. Of course, German still has the full-scale Old Germanic gender pattern where you have masculine, feminine, or neuter, and the way to refer to these words changes depending on both the gender and the case. The Scandinavian languages no longer have cases, but they do still have a masculine, a feminine, and a neuter. And in Dutch, the masculine and the feminine have combined, and it has a different form to the neuter. Now, this is all a lot of grammar and history that isn't particularly relevant, but the point is that there are different forms to refer to different nouns, but that a lot of the time in these multi-ethnolects, these are ignored in favor of the common gender. So in Dutch, that would be the masculine / feminine form rather than the neuter form. So normally you would say dat tientje, that tenner, but they are using a lot of the time die tientje because die is found more frequently. The same thing is true in Rinkeby-svenska when there is overuse of en rather than et, because et and en denote a different gender, but frequently these rules are ignored and a simpler form is being used. In German, we find the same thing, but also, of course, with its case system, we have that there are different inflection patterns for possessive pronouns, like my. So really, it should be aber meine Schwester, but they have simply used aber mein Schwester, ignoring the case system. This is quite interesting in and of itself, as this is something that we also regularly see with the creation of creoles, patois, and pidgins, which I've talked about in other videos as well. So perhaps it's something similar that we have going on. A final point to quickly look at is the use of irregular plurals. This is something that we see in MLE. It's something I talked about in the kebabnorsk video as well, where they are using one form of plural rather than other kinds of plurals, which is rather interesting. So one example example that we see is that the plural of child, instead of becoming children, which is obviously irregular in English or appears irregular, they simply use childs. A more complex one is the plural of man, which has 4 different variants in MLE. So either you get man, mans, so this is simply applying the same plus S pattern onto the word. Man itself can also be used in a plural sense and is indeed actually being used as a kind of pronoun. So, I don't know, like man's got the ting and that, yeah? So that's something like saying one has rather than saying a man has. So it's become a kind of pronoun. A third form that we find is men's. So this is, of course, using the actual standard plural, but they've added on an S as well. The reason why we have man and men is through eye mutation and old Germanic linguistic change that has occurred. And so it's interesting that this then became used in the English language to denote singular from plural, just as we find it in Norwegian, where mum and mem are also singular and plural. But here we have a combination of both this eye mutated form, men, plus S. And a final form is just the standard English plural form, men. So here we see an example where this multiethnolect does not actually necessarily become simpler. And here we have a whole variety of different forms being used. You may, however, say, well, this to me looks like a bit of a textbook rookie error. So if you're learning another language, you don't know which form to use, you sort of overgeneralize rules and then you do it wrong. And that's what this is. So isn't this just people, immigrants, coming over and failing to learn the standard language properly? Well, I won't blame you for thinking that, because a lot of these changes do appear to come from incorrect learning or incomplete learning. But there is more scholarship to this. So Hike Wiese says about this, however, these youth varieties are not forms of second language acquisition themselves. While one finds different instances of untutored second language acquisition in their contexts, as described above, as a result of new immigration or new exposure to the majority language in kindergarten or school, these varieties do not have the respective majority languages as their target. Rather, as mentioned earlier, a lot of speakers can switch between standard and multi-ethnolect. Crucially, these youth languages encompass speakers with migrant background as well as those without, that is, native speakers of the majority language. And among those with migrant background, quite a few will have had early exposure to the respective majority language and speak it fluent. So the thing is that this incorporates both people who are learning the target language, so let's say English in the case of MLE or Norwegian in the case of kebab norsk, as a second language, but also increasingly people who speak Norwegian or English as a first language, people who may not even be from a migrant background, whose parents speak, let's say, standard English or standard Norwegian, but who can still speak these forms. And studies have shown that people are capable of speaking standard as well as multi-ethnolect. There's another interesting point as well that is brought up by Kotsinas in their research, which is the fact that some of the deviant features in immigrant varieties, such as incorrect word order and certain intonation patterns, seem to occur more often in adolescent varieties than in the speech of preschool children, could in fact signify an emerging common group. So let's say that this was people learning to speak incorrectly. Surely children would be learning more of these incorrect forms. They would learn over time and then correct themselves. Whereas actually what we see is that these adolescents are using more of these incorrect forms than children, meaning it's something they have actually learned and chosen to do rather than something that they're doing because they're unaware that it's a mistake in the standard language. And that, Kotsinas argues, is signifying an emerging common group identity. It's something that they're choosing to speak in order to create a common identity rather than choosing to speak in the standard, which they are capable of doing. So then, what shared features can we decide about these multi-ethnolects that are appearing throughout European cities? Well, there are a few interesting ones. So some features that are in these new standards come from language contact, when immigrants speaking one language come into a new country and start learning. This is both in terms of vocabulary, where we have loan words and loan phrases like wallah and kiz, to mention just two, and in terms of phonology, where we get different pronunciations occurring, like the Moroccan accent that we find in the Straattaal in the Netherlands. While these begin as contact features, they soon acquire social meaning as second-generation speakers are more comfortable in host language. So this is what we've just described, that even though some of these features may be seen as mistakes early on, they actually are no longer mistakes at this point because many of the people speaking it speak the standard as a first language or are able to speak it as a first language. And so they become conscious choices. Thirdly, other features are from overgeneralizations by second language learners. As previously, these are continued by choice. So think, for example, about the examples in Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, and German about the word order, or about the way that the common gender is being used. That's an overgeneralization. It's something that I found when I was learning to speak Norwegian, that I would use et more frequently than I necessarily had to, because I didn't know that book was feminine. It's then boka rather than buket, but it's something as a second language speaker that you do. However, it seems now that these are also being continued by choice. And finally, we find that there is a freer use of language and readier acceptance of variations and the extension or elaboration of latent patterns in the majority language. So with this, we see, for example, the case of the plural of man, that we have so many different forms of variation that exist. Not necessarily that they're unaware of what the standard plural form should be, but there is more tolerance of variation, probably because the speaker base has so many different first languages, or parents have so many first languages, that there is more acceptance of variety within the spoken language form. Writing on the future of these multi-ethnolects in Europe, Cheshire et al. Say, is not clear whether the concept of group second language acquisition and the question of which linguistic forms will survive are equally applicable to other European contexts. In the Netherlands, the first observations of multi-ethnolects are from the late 90s. Now, 15 to 20 years later, new generations are using multi-ethnolects. The mechanisms by which the relevant linguistic forms are generated may be the same, perhaps worldwide, but the actual linguistic forms are changing continuously, with not only words but also other elements becoming outdated years or sometimes only months later. In a different vein, Heike Wiese once again says, could they have a similar impact on the majority language as the German and Polish ethnolects that led to the urban dialect in New York State? An important feature that distinguishes the varieties we discussed here from those ethnolects is the fact that Kiesdeutsch and its counterparts are youth languages. They are linguistic practices related to youth culture. They might be recognized by adults and might to some degree be familiar to them, but at least at present, they seem not to be spoken by adults, which curtails their possible influence on a general dialect. In favour of such an influence, however, is the widespread knowledge of these varieties, and in particular, the fact that they are not confined to children and grandchildren of immigrants. As pointed out in the introduction, in particular in neighbourhoods with a large migrant population, these varieties are used in the non-stylized form by adolescents from migrant and non-migrant backgrounds alike. As these speakers grow up, traces of these multi-ethnic youth languages and their grammatical innovations might be preserved in their local dialects. So let me know, what do you think about these multi-ethnolects? Are you a speaker of one of these? Are you from an urban area in Europe? And if so, I'd love to hear from you and what your thoughts are about these. Did you know about these forms that are appearing? If you're living in a country, you're probably aware of the one from your capital or the one from your city. But I was not particularly aware that this was something that is being studied in and of itself. Of course, growing up, I was aware of the way that we describe them as Rajis from London would talk. But it's interesting moving to Norway, coming into contact with kebab norsk, and having to ask people like, what does it mean when something is spa? And being like, that doesn't seem like a Norwegian word, and it turns out it's a Berber word. And I'm like, oh, that's why. But anyway, thought it was something a little bit different, some very modern sociolinguistics to dive into. It's been a really long video, so if you've made it this far, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be back with some more regular history soon enough. Alright everyone, thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next one.